Okay, so can everyone see that? It should be my name. Are we good to go?
Yep, we can see it. That's
okay,
good.
Perfect. So I'm gonna take off then. So like Professor Bloom said, my name is Susanna Crum, and I am based in Louisville, Kentucky, where I was born and raised. I actually went to school in Central New York at Cornell University for my BFA, focusing in printmaking, and then University of Iowa for my MFA, also in printmaking, but also in intermedia and sculpture. And so that is one of the many ties that bind my connection with Professor Bloom. And we both went there for school and overlapped for a couple of years. So it's a pleasure to talk with you all today. Usually I rely on like looking at your facial expressions, like if anything's confusing or somebody has a question. I encourage you all, we will have some Q&A. I'll leave plenty of time for that. But if there are questions midway, let me know. I would love to be there with you in person. We're going to do our best with me talking to my screen and imagining you. So what I do, I teach art at Indiana University Southeast. I also run a studio called Calliope Arts in Louisville, and I'm actually there right now. I'm above the printmaking studio that my partner Rudy Salgado and I established, 7 years ago now. It's kind of crazy to think about. And I would consider myself a research-based maker. And so I'm really interested in maps and schematic diagrams and their intersections with how print technology, like woodcut, engraving, everything up to now offset lithography, and then digital and web-based media, how they produce knowledge and how they produce the way that we talk about and think about places. So this is actually kind of a view of the house. You see the windows behind me. Those are the second floor windows of this building. This is the image that I produced with Flat Tail Press. This is a schematic diagram of sorts in stone lithography of all the different things that happen in this one building that my partner and I live and work in. We live on the third floor. I have my office and studio on the second floor, which is where I am now, kind of grounding us here. And then the first floor is home to Calliope and also River City Tintype, which is a wet plate collodion photography studio. So what got me into printmaking, I think in the very beginning, I always loved drawing and painting. And in high school, I got to use a printing press a couple times. But in college, I just fell in love with the history, the fact that I could see people in the Middle Ages kind of mimicked in a way in studios in the 21st century. So this is Edinburgh Printmaker's studio in Edinburgh, Scotland, and artists working together or working with this strange equipment from different eras. You're always kind of confronting history and the structuring of knowledge, because printmaking has always been the way that we share events and posters and revolutions and news and science, because it was the way that we reproduced images. Before Gutenberg and movable type. So being from Louisville, Kentucky, you can see these are two maps of the city. We're on a bend of the Ohio River, which has been a major highway for humans for millennia. And also in the Civil War, a real division point between North and South. So Indiana to the north and Kentucky to the south of the river. So even as a little kid, Louisville has a historic busing program with schools. And the busing program took me as a first grader all the way across the city to go to school. And I remember thinking like, oh, okay, why do I have to travel so far to go? And a lot of this is in the public school system and in any kind of civic infrastructure, this is informed by history and sometimes dark, unfortunate history, such as redlining. So if anyone's heard about redlining, this was a map making exercise by the federal government and real estate agents. You can see in this residential security map, where the government and real estate determined who could rent and who could buy buildings and homes in which areas of the city. And this was in many ways to reinforce segregation and resulted in a lot less home ownership and accumulated wealth of Louisville's minority and African-American residents. So part of my experience as a first grader, even though I didn't really know it, of course, was this busing was an integration method by the public school system that relied on a mapping strategy that was decades old. So thinking more about maps and how I was brought up, growing up as a white kid in Kentucky and learning that Kentucky was a hunting ground and, Native Americans didn't really live there because they were always moving. But then looking closer at projects that are on web platforms like Native Land, and this may be something that you all talk about in North Dakota a lot. I'm sure North Dakota has a map like this. It's featured on Native Land. I'd encourage you to look it up. But if you see Louisville in the middle here, we had all these different peoples living in, residing, and working in these spaces. So thinking about layers of history, whose land belongs to who, where are you allowed to go, how do things work, and how do you represent how something works? That's something that was always interesting to me. This is a weird drawing that I did as a kid, but it wasn't weird to me. I would make drawings like this. These schematics of, I think I actually built this boat, but this was a planning device of what materials would go where and how it was going to come together. And it's just one of my favorite drawings that I've made. And I think my sketchbook still kind of looks like this. But thinking about how we present information to people and how we structure the way that we think about how things work, whether it's society presented through a map, or it's a, exploded diagram that you get with an IKEA bookshelf. So thinking more about maps, these were the kind of books I was really into when I was, formulating what I was going to do and what I wanted to make. Books like Dune, and maybe you all have seen the most recent release of the movie. I'm bad, I have not yet. But books that have entire glossaries and maps and almost they feel so real because they're assigned these schematic devices, these ways of thinking about them as complete, fleshed out places. So years later, having this interest in analyzing and investigating, I love going to historical archives and working with collections to find things to make work about. I'm really interested in what is not represented in historical archives or in social histories, for instance. So I was invited in 2014 to work with the collection at the Kentucky Derby Museum in Louisville. And if you all don't know, Kentucky Derby is like the biggest deal. It's 2.5 minutes long and horses race, and it's been going since 1875. And everybody comes into town and has a huge party. But working with the collection of the Derby Museum, I was looking for photographs of the first jockeys who won the race and realized and this should be common knowledge, and hopefully it is more now than it was in 2014. I think it is. But the first 12 winners of the first 15 Kentucky Derbies were African-American jockeys. And a lot of them were not pictured. So you'll see those little silhouettes on the side. So ultimately, after about 1902, more and more jockeys were white. African-American jockeys have these amazing stories of moving across the Atlantic to Europe and continuing their, they were the first great American athletes, you could argue. So they continued their careers abroad. One of them raced for the Russian Tsar and then escaped after the revolution with like horses across Poland. There are these amazing stories about these people. But installing this multi-panel drawing, it's a drawing and collage. There's a bunch of stuff going on. Installing it at the Kentucky Derby Museum started, at least in that instance and in that show, conversations about, where else do we see Isaac Lewis's name in this museum? And at the time, we didn't see it. So I had the opportunity later to actually project a version of this artwork on the racetrack, the Jockey Club. Actually, this was the building where the aristocracy would sit to watch the races. But these were huge. This was in collaboration with an artist, Tiffany Carbonneau. And then we did a few more of these together. It was really interesting to share artwork outside a gallery context on the side of a building. We call this architectural video projection. So we were able to make animated kind of passages through maps and through time and through ephemera, like advertisements and newspaper articles that we would find in archives. And then we would be able to overlay those to tell the story about a place. And like I said before, I work often with historical archives and research collections in my work. I think sometimes, those can be at universities or at libraries or historical societies who are kind of like, you're an artist. What are you going to do? Are you going to get paint on our stuff? It's really, I can't emphasize enough to you all, once you actually get into places where they'll pull historical materials for you to look at in person, usually I've found a real welcome. It is a little intimidating to break into sometimes. I got to go to University of Edinburgh back in 2016 to their research collection. And this kind of looks like any other place, like Indiana Historical Society, Kentucky Historical Society. They're all kind of like this, where they have special things in boxes and folders. You go through their collection and see one thing at a time. And that's such a special moment for me that's resulted in big changes in my work. So at the Edinburgh Historical Collection, I got the chance to see this huge, it was probably 3 feet in diameter globe that was on display on a site that I was researching. And what was interesting to me about this globe was that it didn't have typical borders of countries like we're used to. It had these color-coded marks that people think were weather patterns, but it was this Patrick Geddes, who's a sociologist, kind of Renaissance dude. We don't really know what he was up to when he made this globe. So there's this kind of mystery to a map. And so I started thinking more about, maps and present representations of place. And this is a world map that was an engraving from 1569. And I found out that the Google Earth map actually is a Mercator projection. So this guy in the 1560s developed a way to see the globe on a flat surface that is still used by Google Earth, which I know I use to navigate my entire landscape. And of course, we all know about, Greenland isn't that big, and there's distortion that's part of this kind of, just this flattening of a 3D surface to a 2D surface. So thinking about, and in 2018, Google Maps actually provided a globe format to look at, and they were able to do that because finally enough people had processing power on their computers to see a globe. It was available technology, it was new. And thinking about what is included in a map, I could look at a Google map from an IP address in another country and see something completely different. So there are choices that happen from the map maker. Remembering, of course, that we're always looking at somebody's set of decisions whenever we see something that's fact, there's a lot to look into and think about, and a lot of maps are really bound up with history. So I started making my own globes because I fell in love with that globe in Edinburgh. I found software and talked with artists and artisans in Germany and France, got in touch with them over Instagram, which was really nice. So we just talked back and forth about what Photoshop plugins to use and how to translate a drawing, like a flat rectangular drawing, to these pointy ovals that you need to make a sphere, to make a globe. And so I started out, my first globe that I made was with hand-drawn imagery, so black ink on clear film. And the first globe I made was each country. I looked up banknote imagery from each country and then took some of that, so their paper money, took those patterns and images and superimposed them on their locations, and then created a cyanotype globe with that. And so I was using I think it's actually half of a disco ball as a mold. This is a 28-inch diameter globe cast in plaster. So talking with the German and French globe makers was important. I also read like treatises on globe making from 1700. Those were helpful too. The next big globe project that I did it was not a global globe, it was a local globe. So this is the Ohio River. And so I drew a rectangular map using the Procreate software, which some of you may be familiar with. I'm finding that more and more of the students I work with use Procreate. It's available on like a tablet. So you work in layers like you would in Photoshop. So here you'll see the Ohio River over from 1790s to 2019. So I traced over maps, historic maps, all the way through to present day maps, transferring the representations of the river and of railways and waterways, just to see. I think I was interested in seeing a map over time and playing with those variables of the map, place and time. Again, this is a cyanotype. We actually, when my partner Rudy and I were at Minot for our visiting artist time, that was 2019, we did cyanotypes with some of you who may have been there. So then I was able to translate that rectangular drawing to a globe format using that special software. And you can see the pointy ovals in the background. Those are called gores. And so I'm really interested in thinking about, this is part of the process, thinking about merging really, really old technology. So like 1700s plaster casting globe making techniques with, for instance, a laser cutter, which is that image in the lower left-hand corner that helped me I cut a jig essentially for shaving down the plaster so that it was perfectly round. So really making those old and new technologies collide in a way is something very interesting to me. And that's the content of my work too, is imagery from 1793 merged with imagery from 2021 using an old print technology like cyanotype. And so I think in future projects, and I've gotten into other projects in the meantime, but I'm very interested in community-based research, archival research, figuring out, what would be the equator of another place. And thinking about these as alternative maps. We have maps that we know in our heads and that we use on our phones. But how do we think about our places and what's important to us and what the boundary lines are, where we go and where we don't go and why? So my most recent project took place during a sabbatical that I had in fall of last year, so fall 2021. And this involved making tintype photographs, wet plate collodion images of post offices in the state of Kentucky. So this is my partner Rudy with a camera and a coal truck in coal country at dawn. I brought to the collaboration, of course, my in-depth experience, I suppose. I keep making them, cyanotypes. I love them as photographic images. They were the first photographic illustrations ever made, and Anna Atkins is known for her publication. For anyone who hasn't made a cyanotype before, what she did is she coated a piece of paper with light sensitive solution, plopped a piece of algae down on top of that coated paper, exposed it to the sun, and then washed the paper, revealing this photographic reproduction of the algae. And so this blew people's minds at the time. William Fox Talbot was working on a similar process with photogenic drawings at the time. She beat him to it in her publication. And so there's this real, and John Herschel was one of the inventors, and he was an astronomer. So this kind of image making has been bound in science and in distributing kind of ideas of facts, even before we knew about other photographic processes. So shortly thereafter, everybody and their brothers trying to invent the best photographic method. There are photographers who are taking portable darkrooms to war zones and presenting the hard truth that nobody had seen before about what war looked like and its aftermath, and also for their part, staging images. There were other photographers, these were also new technologies at the time. Photographers capturing spirits in their images, spirits of the dead relatives of the sitters. People were going to war in the US and going to the Civil War. They were getting images of their loved ones made. And then just a lot of death and sadness, but also the birth of the photo album. So my partner Rudy has been making tintypes for going on 3 years now. And for my sabbatical, we were really interested in this. There's an inherent kind of ghostliness to recording images by hand, coding the plate by hand and then waiting in a mobile darkroom to see what appears. And so thinking about tintypes and early photographs as a medium to share and memorialize and connect with people, I found in my research that tintypes were the first images put in the mail, like photographic images. They're on metal, so they're sturdy enough to survive being mailed. And at the time where tintype was really big, I would say 1860s through 1930s, everybody was writing letters. And many people in the US, at least, were moving. They were relocating for work. Great migration was happening. There was a real rush to map and expand the information network of the post system. So the project that we did, and we're still working on, it was a big project, documented what post office looked like when letters and tintypes were really the first social media. So we had to find the places. So this is like my research fandom, really. I got to spend lots of time looking at archival documents, and also I used a hunting software called Onyx Hunt to find former locations of post offices and figure out who to write. We wrote letters to property owners to let them know that we were coming and we were going to be setting up a mobile darkroom, and it takes hours to do the process. I referred them to, and I brought these records for the places. National Archives has all of these proposals and hand-drawn maps of where the post offices were located. And this is so mail carriers knew where to go. These are some of the letters. And so when we went on site, like I said, we were there for hours making plates. The tintype process, some of you, you're really lucky that you have a strong alternative photography program at Minot. Some of you may have done tintypes before. You should know you're super lucky, and that is unusual. But we were hand pouring each plate in the darkroom and then loading them into these cameras that are combination 1930s, 1980s, 1860s, like all these different parts and pieces from different eras in history. We went to 9 places. What I really loved about this kind of image making, the photographer Sally Mann wrote that this beautiful quote, I'll let you read it, but it's actually making images rather than taking them. And she says it's not a drive-by shooting. So we were going to places often that were super remote and poor, small towns that had, their post office had been decommissioned. And when a post office is decommissioned, you often lose the name of your town because the town's name was established when the post office was established. And so these places that are really, we were talking with a lot of older community members about the past, about the heyday and use of the post office. And being there with the darkroom and with this kind of strange ritual of tintype photography put us in a position to really talk with people. For the most part, people wanted to talk to us. Some people did not. And that's understandable too. So these are some of the finished products. In tintype, you get these strange kind of ghostly comets sometimes. There's one on the right-hand side. Some sites didn't have the post office anymore. In Golden Pond's case, a highway was built on top of it, and it's in the land between the lakes region in Kentucky, which was seized by the federal government, and towns were moved. And the only thing that's on this land now is cemeteries, and the rest is just a national recreation area. It's very strange. Golden Pond was their post office. So there's an image actually by Micah Bloom of us working at Minot. It's just one of my favorite images of Rudy and I talking or working together. That's kind of my current studio practice. And I also wanted to cover briefly just some information about my studio. So I'm someone who really needs and wants to be around other artists when I'm making work. So the first floor of this building has Calliope, and this is kind of what it looks like. And we invite artists to come and make work. Micah Bloom actually came a couple years ago to make a stone lithograph here using this very press, the one in the right-hand picture. This is an example of our most recent artist, another University of Iowa and Flat Tail Press alum, Zach Stenson. And you can see there's a chicken. You find the chicken. There's a chicken in the lower right-hand corner, our chicken Margot. We have a big garden in the backyard. So we produced this image with him. Zach used a Cricut machine to cut relief printed fabric in this kind of elaborate paint by number format. Something else that Calliope does, and that we had to do when we were getting started, that if you're thinking about starting a studio, something that's really important is we had to explain to people in local government, to our accountant. We had to do all this businessy stuff that you have to do as an artist. But we really had to learn quickly how to explain what we were doing. So this is an image of Rudy in our preliminary planning. He would bring a portfolio of prints to talk to small business advisors and bankers and people to explain that we weren't going to be a competitor of Kinko's or FedEx Office. Something else that we love, and this is an image from our the Flat Tail Press exhibition. We did a demo, the image on the left. But we like together to spend a lot of time doing demos in public spaces and at events. And a lot of that we get to do as Calliope. We're not a nonprofit. We often are brought in as the professional advisors for grants. Being a nonprofit, you would have to apply for grants all the time. So instead, we let other nonprofits apply for them, and then they hire us in. So Smoke Down, Get Down, for example, was funded by a series of nonprofits in Louisville to have a block party, and they paid us to be there. We also show work by over 40 artists in our studio. We use those as teaching tools, but also we're really interested in getting everybody to collect original artwork. When we got started, we built a lot of our own equipment, like this exposure unit on the right. We bought our litho press in Minneapolis and hauled it down to Louisville and took it apart. We found its original press number for when it was probably in a newspaper printing house. Building more equipment. So you got to take your sculpture classes seriously because you may need to take your own, build your own racks and furniture. And so it took us a couple years to come up with all our equipment. And part of that, we didn't have a startup budget, we didn't have investors or like a huge, finances to rely on. So we just took our time and had alerts on eBay for when presses came up. So now our studio has equipment for lithography and leaf and screen printing and intaglio. This was from our official grand opening many years ago now. Our most recent project is called C19. And when at the height of COVID lockdown, like April 2020, Rudy and I were bringing like litho stones and tracing paper and art materials across the city to artists and musicians, teachers, and they all created intaglio screen prints, relief prints, and lithos with us. So we taught them how to do the process. A lot of the time, these were not printmakers who we involved in the project. We gave them step-by-step videos and advice, and they all made images kind of in response to the time. And then we sold those and donated a portion of the proceeds to an artist relief trust that had micro grants for local artists. So if you're thinking of starting your own studio, feel free to get in touch with me. We talked with so many people who run their own studios all throughout the US, and I'm really interested in paying it forward. These are my tips. You want to connect with other studios to see what they're doing and if they're doing it the way that you want. Something big for me is that we live upstairs, so we only have one rent/mortgage payment. And that allows us, during COVID, we were just like, okay, we can switch gears. We have that capability. Allow time, like I said, to find the right equipment for less money. I would really recommend finding out what organizations are in your community who might be interested in supporting you or bringing you in on a grant. You've got to know your city government, because governments often are very risk averse when it comes to artists. They think that we're going to destroy everything, which is not the case. And you want to be a good example and a good self-advocate to get them to believe you, to believe in your mission, and just, be persistent. I don't know why that URL is so big, but there it is. Calliope Arts. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Can you hear me, Susanna?
Here.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So that was fantastic. Thank you for the wonderful talk here. Is there any questions that anybody has for Susanna? There were some, I think somebody had some comment. Question? Yeah, did you have a question or a comment? Oh, here we go. Hold on.
Hello.
Hi.
I really liked the color of the globes because it reminded me of like porcelain china, like a deep blue, and very nice contrast.
Thank you.
Why did you choose cyanotype?
I think, like I said, I'm really interested in, as a printmaker, we have so many media to our disposal or at our disposal. Each, a woodcut is always going to look way different than an etching or a lithograph. And then when you get into alternative photography processes, it's kind of similar in that way. They all look different for different reasons. And they all have social histories that are really specific. Because I'm interested in how print media kind of produces and shares knowledge, whether it's fictional or factual. I'm really interested in cyanotypes history and its root in science and engineering, like the blueprint, for instance, in urban planning and architecture. And so I'm interested in that kind of play. Of course, there's not a historical Cyanotype Globe necessarily. I would love to see one. I haven't seen any from history, but it does reside in that kind of visual landscape of the blueprint and of kind of a public facing civic engagement.
Thank you. Is there maybe one more question for Susanna? Somebody have a comment? Here we go. We got some Virginia.
So you made the rivers of Louisville into that globe. Was that like some kind of a statement? Like what was like the thinking behind that?
Yeah. I think that I'm interested in a globe being not global. So thinking about if you could look at a 3D representation of a place, and something that's central to the place where I'm from and where I live is the river. For many reasons, like the division between North and South, the cultural divisions, like being a Southerner versus being a Midwesterner. There's a big difference when you cross the river, kind of in terms of our assumptions about people. And so thinking about that as an imaginary kind of boundary line and the importance throughout history of the Ohio River and the people who have used it. So I think that's kind of what I was thinking about, alternate equators.
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful, wonderful idea, Susanna. I met a man here in Minot who was 54 years old. He had said he had never left the state of North Dakota. And so physically, like his whole globe, like to move around is just North Dakota. It's just physically, he's only been in North Dakota. And that I love the idea of just that space and then becoming a globe. So it's just a cyclical kind of thing. You move around, that's your space. And that's kind of all maybe you know, it's interesting. All right. Well, I think we have come to our time, and we are very grateful for your time and your efforts. And there's so much more that we don't even know of what you're doing, which is so awesome. So, all right, let's give her a hand. All right. Woo. Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you.
Greg, anything else, Greg, you need to say? Or, all right. So great to see you, Susanna. And
good to see you.
Thanks for all your good work. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Susanna. Thank you.
Thank you.